Right. Good afternoon. Committee will come to order, and the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. First, I really want to thank Chairman Pitts, Dr. Burgess, Mr. Barton, Mr. Waxman, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Dingell, and really all the members on both sides of this committee for their bipartisanship throughout this process over the last number of months. The bill before us today is certainly a reflection of their hard work and willingness on both sides to look at the issues together and find common ground. Because of that hard work, we have a bill today that will help American patients and American innovators. As I've said since the very beginning of the Congress, we need to enact this user fee by the end of June, and we are certainly on track to accomplish that goal. Under the direction of Chairman Pitts, the Subcommittee on Health held 4 hearings last year and 6 hearings this year to examine the different FDA user fee programs and related FDA policies. We have had an open and deliberative process. I want to thank him again and Ranking Member Pallone for the manner in which the subcommittee has conducted this important work. The subcommittee marked up the bill yesterday and reported it out by a voice vote. My hope is that the full committee will favorably report this bill tomorrow morning, and then we can have the bill on the House floor later this month. That will give us the time to work with our friends in the Senate to have the bill to the President before the 4th of July. And as we put the package together, I wanted to ensure that it fostered American innovation, which is essential in getting new treatments to patients and creating American jobs. And because of the hard work of the committee members on both sides of the aisle, I am convinced that we indeed have done that. Finally, I'd like to pay special attention to Rachel Scheer. Right? Scheer. I'm sorry. Rachel Scheer of the minority staff and Clay Alsbach of the majority staff, who each have 2 young children at home, despite spending countless hours over the past 5 months organizing hearings and poring over legislation. Without their work, we wouldn't have had the quality product before us today, and I want to extend my appreciation and gratitude. The Chair now recognizes the ranking minority member, Mr. Waxman, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, this bill represents a significant bipartisan achievement. Its consideration is a model for legislative action. When we began this process, there were wildly divergent views on the various issues contained in the bill, but we worked together and found ways to address those issues in a way that protects both innovation and patients. As we all know, timely passage of this legislation is critical to the functioning of major parts of the FDA. Our reauthorization of FDA's drug and medical device user fee programs will provide resources to enable the efficient review of applications and give patients access to therapies at the earliest possible time. We are also reauthorizing 2 pediatric programs, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, which give FDA the authority to obtain information about the use of drugs in children. This year, we will be establishing 2 new programs to help speed FDA's review of low-cost generics and biosimilars. Generic drugs account for nearly 80% of all prescription drugs in the United States. They play a vital role in keeping our overall health care costs down. Unfortunately, in recent years, a lack of resources in FDA's generic drug review program has resulted in significant delays in the agency's review of generic applications. As a result, generic competition has suffered. The Generic Drug User Fee Act will provide a much-needed infusion of dollars that will enable the agency to finally reverse this trend. All of us will see the benefits when more low-cost generics are on the market. The Biosimilars User Fee Act will similarly provide FDA with new dollars to review applications for biosimilars. More biosimilars on the market will not only lower prices, but will stimulate innovation. The bill also includes provisions to modernize FDA's authorities with respect to the drug supply chain. FDA has been trying to keep pace with our increasingly globalized drug supply chain using an outdated statute. This legislation will give FDA critical new tools to police this dramatically different marketplace. We base these provisions on Mr. Dingell's, Mr. Pallone's, Mr. Getz, and my Drug Safety Enhancement Act, and I'm pleased that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle recognized the importance of this problem and worked on a bipartisan basis to address it. When we started this process, I had a lot of concerns about many of the different proposals, but we worked through those, and I feel that we've included some important provisions that will go a long way toward addressing drug shortages, which have unfortunately now become an all too frequent occurrence. Our bipartisan plan has truly paid off. While I support this bill, it's no secret that I continue to have strong concerns in the area of antibiotics. I agree that we need to look at ways to incentivize the development of new antibiotics, but I'm disappointed that we did not adequately narrow the provisions of the GAIN Act to target only drugs that treat serious and life-threatening infections. As the bill reads now, essentially any antibiotic can qualify for the incentives included in the bill. That threatens to worsen the problem of antibiotic resistance. I also think it's critical that when we get new antibiotics, we need to ensure that we take all necessary steps to prevent unnecessary use so that we preserve their effectiveness. I'm happy the issue is being addressed in the report language that was added to the bill, but I hope it can continue to work to include a directive to HHS to institute programs that would preserve new antibiotics that are developed as a result of the GAIN Act. Going forward, I hope we can continue to work on ways to address these issues. I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and their staffs for the hard work they have put into making this a strong bipartisan bill. I particularly want to thank Mr. Pallone and Mr. Dingell's staff members, Tiffany Garacheo and Tim Trezak, as well as Mr. Upton and Mr. Pitt's staff, Ryan Long and Clay Alsbach. And finally, my own staff, Karen Nelson, Rachel Scher, Eric Flam, and Aaron Patel. I don't want to single out any of them because they have children or don't have children. All of them deserve praise, and I'm pleased that they served us all so well in getting this legislation together. I look forward to continuing to work to move this important legislation through the floor and into law at the earliest possible time. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bonoback, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With nearly 30,000 Americans dying each year from prescription drug abuse, I commend Chairman Upton, Health Subcommittee Chairman Pitts, and Ranking Members Waxman and Pallone for including my language in the committee print to combat this deadly public health epidemic. The language is an important step in addressing what the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention now calls the fastest growing health problem in America. It directs the Secretary of HHS, in coordination with other federal agencies, to identify gaps and opportunities in ensuring the safe use of prescription drugs such as opiates and anti-anxiety pills. Most importantly, this will assist in the development and implementation of best practices and standards to achieve interoperability for state prescription drug monitoring programs to function across state lines, as well as the dissemination of provider-patient education tools that promote an understanding of the signs and symptoms of prescription drug abuse. Additionally, my language also requires the FDA to provide guidance within 6 months of enactment on the approval process for tamper-resistant drugs. Clearly, more has to be done to save American lives. Today, 2 classes of medicines, painkillers and insomnia/anxiety drugs, are responsible for about 70 deaths and nearly 3,000 emergency room visits a day. These are stunning numbers. But here's what's even more alarming. The death toll from overdoses of these powerfully addictive medicines has risen dramatically in recent years, claiming more lives today than heroin and cocaine combined. In fact, for the first time ever, drug deaths now outnumber traffic fatalities and have become the leading cause of accidental death in America. And there's no end in sight to the problem. According to a recent Monitoring the Future national survey, nearly 1 in 4 12th graders have abused prescription drugs. Think about that. 25% of our kids are graduating today with a degree in prescription drug abuse. Doctor shopping is another widespread problem which contributes to our nation's alarming prescription drug addiction rate, increasing costs to all of us through higher insurance rates, and it makes it extremely difficult for the DEA to crack down on abusers. As we've learned in my hearings, compounding the problem is an oftentimes false sense of security. If it's approved by the FDA and prescribed by a doctor, then it must be okay, and that's just wrong. Too many pills taken at once or combining them with other drugs and alcohol can have serious and even deadly consequences. There's yet an even more insidious side of the story as well. After becoming addicted to prescription painkillers, more and more people are switching to heroin. And just one example, in San Diego County, which borders my district, drug treatment experts say the use of heroin by young adults has more than tripled since 2006. Much of this growth is due to people who have switched to heroin as a cheaper alternative to drugs such as OxyContin. This is our chance, Mr. Chairman, to save countless lives and to spare thousands of American families from the heartache of addiction. I thank you for your help, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair would recognize the ranking member of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Upton. I'm not going to take all the time, but thank you for holding today's markup on the FDA Reform Act of 2012. I'm really pleased the committee is swiftly moving this important piece of legislation forward. As you know, yesterday the Subcommittee on Health favorably reported the bill by a unanimous voice vote. And I'll echo the same sentiments I made yesterday. I'm proud of the work we've done, which shows that this committee truly is capable of, and that is compromise. I love compromise. This bill represents a strong, bipartisan, comprehensive agreement and should be a model for legislative action in the future. The FDA Reform Act will reauthorize the user fee program for prescription drugs and medical devices, establish user fee programs for generic drugs and biosimilars, and reform and revitalize many FDA programs, including drug safety and shortage authorities. Together, it will result in critical advancements for the FDA, millions of patients across the country, and the medical industry as a whole. So let me just thank everyone. I want to thank my Democratic colleagues, obviously Ranking Member Waxman and Mr. Dingell, for their leadership and their friendship and solidarity throughout this process. Also their staff, my staff person, Tiffany Garaccio, and Waxman Dingell staff, Rachel Scherer, Eric Flom, Aaron Patel, and Kim Treziak. And I also want to thank you, Chairman, and also Chairman Pitts and your staff, Ryan Long and Clay Alspach, for their sincerity and commitment to working towards a consensus and a bipartisan product. You know, I was actually, today I had a couple of opportunities to talk to different groups in my office or you know, outside, and everybody kept telling me, you know, what's wrong with the Congress? How come you can't get together and come up with consensus approaches or compromise? And I kept talking about the PDUFA and MEDUFA and this bill as an example of what we can do together. So I urge all members to support the bill and look forward to its swift passage into law. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the chair of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The process of putting this user fee package together has taken long hours and hard work, but I'm proud of the product that we have achieved. The bill enjoys bipartisan support as well as the support of the industry and the FDA. It will provide FDA with the resources it needs to approve new drugs and devices in a timely fashion and will speed their access to the public. Innovators and manufacturers will have greater transparency and predictability and certainty in the approval process. As a result of the reforms in this bill, not only will patients benefit from new drugs and treatments, but the United States will be able to maintain its preeminence in the drug and device industries, keeping good-paying jobs here in America. None of this would have been possible without the leadership of our chairman, Chairman Upton, who has been involved in every step of the process. And I also must thank Representatives Dingell and Waxman and Pallone and their staff who were committed to ensuring that this was a bipartisan package and worked with us to that end. I have to give a special thank you to the staff of the full committee and the subcommittee who labored over the package for months, specifically Ryan Long and Clay Osbach and Howard Cohen and Paul Editel and Dr. Nancy Dunlap, as well as personal staff, Monica Vellante and Heidi Stirrup. They have been terrific. And it is my hope that every member of the committee can support this bill before us and that it will pass overwhelmingly when we get to the floor. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize Chairman Emeritus of the full committee, gentleman from the great state of Michigan, Mr.
It is a great state, Mr. Chairman. It produces great members of Congress, too. First, to the staffs of those who worked on this, to you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Pitts, the chairman of the subcommittee, to ranking members Waxman and Pallone and their staffs, staff of the full committee, the subcommittee, I want to congratulate all of them and all of you. One of the remarkable things about this is that when we've had food and drug legislation before this committee, there's always been a huge amount of controversy. That's absent. This is an almost sleepy meeting of the committee. And yet, this is going to be one of the most important pieces of legislation we work on this year. The fact that there is no controversy here indicates that extraordinary good work has been done by all who've worked on it, and that the negotiations have been accomplished with some rather extraordinary success and attentiveness by those who participated. And again, I want to congratulate the staffs. We all know that the industry supports this, the consumer groups support it, and the administration, in fact, everybody else does. You will find virtually no controversy about this. We noticed that heparin was a tremendous warning to the United States. It was a wake-up call to industry, the consumers, food and drug, and it made it clear that FDA needed new tools to discourage the kind of situation there and to detect risks to our food supply. And I want to commend the committee for the drafting of legislation that's going to help us to make real progress towards the goal of seeing to it that our people are safe and seeing to it that food and drug is properly armed with the tools that it needs to do what it must do, and that it is able not only to impose hard remedies upon the American industry, but remedies which have been worked out in consultation with the industry and with their full support. But equally important, or perhaps more so, is for the first time we're able to get at foreign manufacturers abroad to see to it that our people are protected against irresponsible behavior by those people. And also that there is safety in drugs moving across international boundaries. We've built a great deal on the good work that FDA is already doing, and also upon strong agreements negotiated by industry and FDA. And this is going to enable buyers in this country to understand that the product that's produced is going to be an example of what good committee work makes possible to happen. I'm delighted to lend my support to the legislation and to pass this bill swiftly out of committee. And I urge a continued display of unity by all of our committee members on this legislation. I would note that this legislation goes well beyond anything which has ever been done on the question of food and drug safety. And I would hope that my colleagues would understand that all of us have differences we find with parts of this legislation. As I like to observe, the last perfect bill or piece of legislation that was written was done by the finger of God and came off Mount Sinai in the hands of Moses. And I am pleased to note that even that caused a certain amount of distress. Well, we don't need to worry about that. We have done a good job. And I think that to have any fights or troubles stirred up that don't include the support of those who have worked so hard on this would be an unwise step and probably a danger. I know that you, Mr. Chairman, and the Chairman of the Subcommittee and the others of us who've worked on this are willing to hear the concerns of our colleagues. But I do urge on my colleagues a very moderate approach to this legislation. Let's get it done. Let's see to it that we show how this committee can work and how we can work together in a bipartisan way to produce great legislation very much consonant with the public interest and with the needs of the country in an area where enormous risks to the well-being and the safety of the people are always obvious and always a very near danger. I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The Chair would now recognize the other Chairman Emeritus of the full committee, Mr. Barton, from the good state of Texas.
There you go. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the excellent work that you've done, and Mr. Pitts has done, and Mr. Waxman has done, and Mr. Pallone has done, and Mr. Dingell has done on this bill. I'm going to invoke a piece of advice that Chairman Dingell gave me 5 or 6 years ago on another issue where I was trying to get him on a big bill, and he finally agreed to come on the bill and be supportive. And I asked him why. I said, why'd you do that? And he, in the only way that only John Dingell can, and I'm cleaning this up a little bit, but he said, it is better to be in the tent urinating out than to be outside the tent urinating in. And that was good advice then, and it's good advice today. There is a Big Four agreement between you and Mr. Pitts and Mr. Waxman and Mr. Pallone, and a lot of other members have signed off on it. And y'all have done good work. And I was honored to be asked yesterday to be an original co-sponsor of the manager's amendment that's going to be introduced tomorrow. I think is H.R. 5651, is that right? But I have some concerns. My endorsement is qualified because I have been on this committee now for 26 years, have served on the health subcommittee, I think, all of those years, never chaired the health subcommittee, and I have yet to see the FDA really acknowledge its structural and cultural defaults and try to remedy them. So the only time they really listen to us is when they're up for reauthorization. And you and the other leaders and the industry have agreed in good faith, and there is a section, a title of this bill that is called FDA Reform, or FDA Title VI, FDA Administrative Reforms. Mr. Chairman, my problem is that I don't think there are adequate teeth to those reforms. There's not an incentive package, nor is there a punishment package for non-performance. Now, tomorrow in the markup, with your permission, I'm going to offer an amendment to try to address that. And at the appropriate time, I will withdraw it in all probability because I've promised that I would. But that's my concern. Not that this is not a good bill, it is a good bill. Not that it doesn't have good intentions, it has great intentions. Not that it's not necessary, it is very necessary. But I think we need to do more to get the FDA to perform. And hopefully, with all the support that this bill is engendering, at some point in time we may yet do some things in conference with the Senate perhaps to do that. But for today, I am in the tent, and I want to stay in the tent. I am honored to be a part of the process, and I congratulate you and Mr. Waxman on your leadership, and I look forward to the markup tomorrow and then future endeavors on down the road. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognize the gentleman from the good state of Texas, Mr. Green, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And following my colleague from Texas, I thought that saying was a Texas saying because I kept hearing it for so many years, but now I know it came from Michigan. But I want to thank the chairman for the time to speak, and I appreciate the hard work of both Chairman Upton and Pitts and ranking members Waxman and Pallone, and I'm proud that our committee is setting an example for bipartisan compromise and productive governing. Contained in the FDA Reform Act is the GAIN Act, a bill introduced by Congressman Gingrey and myself for a few terms, which is aimed at incentivizing the development of the new antibiotics that will fight the serious and life-threatening infections that mankind will face in the coming years. The GAIN Act provisions of this bill represent a careful bipartisan balance that appropriately protects patient safety and responsibly offers incentives to innovative drug companies seeking to cure our nation's most deadly biological pathogens, such as extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, MRSA, and others that we're currently ill-equipped to treat. Currently, we're unable to manage many significant public health threats posed by these pathogens. While a widespread public health threat is in our future, some people in this country are dying today as a result of drug resistance and superbugs. We hear a lot about the challenge of Southeast Asia, but our health professionals are confronting bacterial infections that are resistant to all currently available antibiotics. Recently, the World Health Organization Director General said things are common as strep throat or a child's scratched knee can once again kill. Hip replacements, organ transplants, cancer, chemotherapy, and care of preterm infants could become far more difficult or even too dangerous to undertake due to the rising threat of superbugs. According to providers I've heard from, drug resistance is already a distinct problem in the front lines of our nation's health delivery. For example, one instance, a 15-year-old girl got her ears pierced. Her earlobe swelled and got red. She went to the emergency room and admitted to IV antibiotics. The infection was resistant to the usual antibiotics, but she became septic and died. There are many other cases which minor injuries or simple procedures produce unexpected complications because of the emerging threat of drug resistance. Because of the nature of this threat, I urge my colleagues as this heads to the floor to hopefully into conference and that no changes be made in GAIN provisions to further limit incentives or reduce the list of pathogens that we're trying to get. Truth is, we don't know what specific public threat will be, and once it's on top of us, it'll be too late. We have to be prepared, and part of that preparedness is getting to our drug companies. Mr. Chairman, again, I'd like to thank you. I think we struck the right balance, and I'll thank my colleague, Congressman Gingrey, for his work on the subcommittee. And again, I support the FDA Reform Act. It deserves to be passed by our committee and on to the conference. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Nebraska for 3 minutes.
Mr. Murphy, I'm more senior. I'll buy you dinner. The purpose of the user fee programs are to help reduce the time in which the FDA can review and make decisions on marketing applications. Lengthy review times for drugs and devices not only affect the industry but the patients who wait, sometimes entirely too long, for these products to reach the marketplace. One population that is especially reliant on the FDA to move products through the approval pipeline are Americans with diabetes. According to the American Diabetes Association, nearly 26 million Americans have diabetes, and every day 230 undergo an amputation, 120 enter end-stage kidney disease programs, and 55 people go blind from their disease. Diabetes costs our nation more than $174 billion a year, and 1 in 3 Medicare dollars is spent to care for people with diabetes. This year's medical device user fee agreement reached a high record of almost $600 million. This large increase in funding from industry to the FDA is meant to augment the staffing, training, and expertise FDA brings to bear on the review of all products, but particularly products which are new and innovative technologies that can transform lives. One such technology is the artificial pancreas, which is under development and could significantly improve the health and quality of life of people with diabetes. To date, the U.S. has lagged behind other nations in approving state-of-the-art production, such as low-glucose suspense systems, which are meant to help those with type 1 diabetes lead healthier, safer, and more productive lives. These pumps stop delivering insulin automatically when a monitor indicates that the body's glucose levels are already low. Otherwise, the continuous delivery of insulin can lead to a seizure, coma, or death. This product has been approved and safely in use for over 2 years in 40 countries worldwide, yet it is still not available in the U.S. I hope that many of the provisions included in this package, such as the reforms to issuance of FDA guideline documents, the investigational device exemption and the clarification of least burdensome standard are taken to heart by officials at the FDA and implemented as quickly as possible once this legislation is signed into law. As Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, I plan on working closely with the Chairman Stearns and Chairman Pitts and the Subcommittee on Health to ensure that industry, patients, and the groups which represent them are seeing a return on the significant investment of capital and hope that has been made with the FDA. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. But gentleman might yield his 5 seconds back to Dr. Murphy. But the chair would now recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Terry, thank you for talking about the low blood glucose cutoff on the insulin pumps. Mr. Whitfield and I are the co-chairs of the Congressional Diabetes Caucus, and you've been working with us on the letter we sent to the FDA to try to speed the approval, and it's because of congressional efforts that they now are looking at this. And as the mother of a type 1 diabetic myself, I can tell you this is a really important advance that we need to have. Mr. Chairman, I also want to thank you for all of the good things that are in this bill, and I just want to mention a few of them. The incentives for antibiotic development that I've worked on with a bipartisan group of committee members led by Dr. Gingrey, it's a really great provision. Or the pathway for breakthrough therapies, something that I feel strongly about and I know has bipartisan support because Mr. Bill Bray and I introduced recently legislation along this lines. Or the supply chain legislation that Mr. Dingell talked about that he's been working tirelessly on for years. But I want to take my almost 2 minutes, Mr. Chairman, and talk about something really important that we've included in this legislation, and that's the issue of drug shortages. All of us have been hearing from our hospitals, our doctors, and our families about these drug shortages. A child is diagnosed with leukemia. The parents are devastated, as we can imagine. They begin a course of chemotherapy recommended by the doctors, and then midway through treatment, they are told the life-saving drug their daughter needs is no longer available. So then they're forced to change to an expensive, less effective treatment system. Figures recently released by the University of Utah Drug Information Service, which tracks national drug shortages, show that there were 56 more newly reported drug shortages in the U.S. last year than in 2010 when there were 211. So there were 211 drug shortages, and now there's 56 more. How can this be happening, and what can we do about it? With Congressman Tom Rooney, I introduced the bipartisan Preserving Access to Life-Saving Medications Act, which now has over 85 co-sponsors. What this bill does is it creates an early warning system between the FDA, drug companies, and providers so that the community can respond to a drug shortage quickly and efficiently. It's modeled on a current voluntary program at the FDA which has worked, and it makes it mandatory. I want to include you, Mr. Chairman, for including our bill in this larger must-pass piece of legislation. Similar language is in the other body, and we believe that it's going to work immediately to help reduce drug shortages. The FDA has prevented 128 drug shortages since November because of the voluntary reporting, and we think this is going to work even better. So thank you again. It's a good bill. There's a lot to like in it, and I don't think we can underestimate how important this drug shortage legislation is going to be. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her kind words, and just want to say, as I was on the floor for the last couple days with votes, there were many members not even on this committee that were thanking us for the inclusion of this provision. It's a major part. We're glad to include it. It makes a lot of sense, and we will fight for it all the way to the President's desk. With that, next in seniority is the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tomorrow, my colleagues, we begin markup of the Food, Drug Administration Reform Act, H.R. 5651, which is based on user fee negotiations between FDA and the prescription drug, generic drug, biologic, and medical device industry. These user fees allow the Food and Drug Administration to meet the demand of drug and medical devices approvals. So in codifying the user fee agreement, this committee has included additional provisions designed to address some of the defects of the regulatory structure and overreach by the FDA. Under my chairmanship of the Oversight and Investigation Committee, we held a hearing into FDA's regulatory efforts in the medical device space. During our hearing, many of the witnesses talked about the reluctance of FDA to approve devices and how FDA continually moved the goalposts for approval. So I'm glad that Title VII of this bill includes a significant number of reform provisions designed to bring certainty to the medical device field. In addition to reforming approaches to medical devices through Title VII, the FDA's approach to rare diseases must also be modernized. I'm happy that the committee included the Faster Access to Specialized Treatment Act, FAST Act, H.R. 4132, which I introduced with my good friend and colleague, Congressman Ed Towns. FAST updates and modernizes Section 506 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and updates the accelerated approval statute to reflect 2 decades' worth of medical science that has occurred since accelerated approval was first created. FAST will help FDA implement broadly effective processes for the expedited development and review of innovative new medicines intended to address unmet medical needs for serious or life-threatening diseases by using modern scientific tools. This may result in fewer, smaller, or shorter clinical trials without compromising FDA's existing high standards to protect patients. FAST also includes explicit language for FDA to think about the challenges of rare diseases when developing their guidance and gives the rare disease community an opportunity to publicly comment on FDA's draft guidance. FAST ensures that the voices of the 30 million Americans with a rare disease will be heard by FDA. FAST will save lives and give a voice to the voiceless. I'm glad it's in the bill. And lastly, I'm glad the committee included the Expert Act, H.R. 4156, a bill that my fellow co-chairs of the Cystic Fibrosis Caucus and I introduced last month. Expert will have the FDA consult with experts in rare diseases. This will ensure that FDA has access to the knowledge needed when dealing with drug approvals for disease that they may lack subject matter expertise. So I support H.R. 5651 and hope for its swift approval and passage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair would now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, one of the reasons that I, as many others here, worked so hard to get onto the Energy and Commerce Committee is because of the bipartisan work that we do. I think we're at our best in this committee when we're working together. And I think that this bill reflects that working together. It's kind of nice, you know, at a time when there's so much arguing and the public is saying that, you know, Congress cannot come together and pass good legislation. Well, here in the Energy and Commerce Committee, we've proven that wrong. We can, and that's what we're doing today. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, along with Mr. Waxman, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Barton, Mr. Pitts, for all of your hard work to reach this bipartisan agreement before us. As someone who cares very much about those suffering with rare diseases, I'm glad to see what this bill includes provisions to improve the accelerated approval pathway for drugs that hold promise for the treatment of diseases like muscular dystrophy or ALS. I've worked very closely with the ALS community, and we've passed legislation on this committee before for ALS. I'm also grateful that the Central Path Public-Private Partnerships, which I worked on with my colleague Representative Blackburn to pass in 2007, have been reauthorized so improvements in regulatory science can continue. And it is my hope that the provision included to alleviate drug shortages will provide helpful to our hospitals, pharmacies, and patients. A drug shortage is certainly a major consideration, and I think we go a long way to alleviate that problem in this bill. So in conclusion, I believe that this bill will help meet the needs of the FDA, industry, and most importantly, patients and consumers. So it's really critical that it be passed quickly. I look forward to its timely consideration before the full House of Representatives. And again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your working in a bipartisan approach to make this such a good finished project. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Chair would now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to follow my friend, Mr. Engel. I agree totally with his words and how sometimes we can get it right and work together, and this is a good example. So I'm glad we're in the position to favorably report H.R. 5651. We haven't always agreed on the path forward on user fees, but this committee has once again shown the process of regular order can work. We held hearings, collaborated with the FDA, and stakeholders and members and staff from both sides of the aisle came together in good faith towards the mutual goal of a bipartisan product. I was glad we were also able to work out an agreement to include antifungals as part of Dr. Gingrich's Bipartisan GAIN Act, which I'm original co-sponsor of. I would encourage this committee to support a strong position on the GAIN Act moving forward so we can incentivize the production of drugs that simply are not being developed today to attack these serious life-threatening pathogens to prevent cases like these. I am particularly pleased the bill contains many of the policy goals from standalone bills I introduced earlier in this Congress, H.R. 3208, the Patients Come First Act, and H.R. 3209, the Pre-Market Predictability Act. These provisions take necessary steps to provide clarity, consistency, and predictability in regulation of medical devices. Whether that is through the 510K process, reaffirming FDA's least burdensome provisions, or requiring pre-market amendments for pre-amendment Class 3 devices, or moving them to Class 2, H.R. 5651 puts us on a path to enhance patient safety, get more life-saving and life-improving devices in our market, stimulate American innovation, which creates jobs, while giving more certainty to industry. I'm also pleased, during the last break that we had, I sat down with a couple people at different times in the healthcare sector. One of their biggest concerns, I mean, they had a whole list of their wants and likes, but the drug shortage issue is really a critical issue that we need to face. And we have language in this bill that starts addressing that, and I'm very pleased about that. So I was able to call the physician that I talked to, and I said, guess what? We've got some language in this bill to really start addressing the drug shortage problem. I commend Chairman Upton, Pitts, along with Ranking Member Waxman and Pallone, Chairman Emeritus Dingell, for their leadership on the user fee agreements, and particularly want to thank each of their staffs, who I know worked long hours and weekends over months that otherwise, without their work, we wouldn't be to where we are today. So not just member collaboration, but staff worked famously together to get this to this product, and I want to thank them personally. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Chairman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Jakowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, support H.R. 5651, the FDA Reform Act of 2012, and I'm pleased that we were able to resolve our disagreements over individual provisions in a bipartisan fashion. And like everyone else has said, isn't this nice when we can all work together and get along and produce a really good product? I, too, want to thank Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Waxman, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone of the Health Subcommittee, as well as Representative Dingell for their leadership and stewardship of this important legislation. I am glad that a plan to revise FDA's mission statement is not included in the legislation. FDA witnesses testified about the, quote, unintended consequences, unquote, of such changes, and remarked that they could lead to troublesome changes at FDA, changes that could actually slow down and complicate the review process, not to mention change the standard of evidence for product approvals. I'm very pleased with the inclusion of language to help advance unique device identification system regulations, but I believe the language included in the Senate reauthorization is stronger. If we want to fully ensure patient and consumer safety, I believe it's essential that all devices have a unique identifier, and we must ensure that regulations are implemented in a timely fashion. The legislation will support the development of drugs to enhance therapeutic options for patients with rare diseases. While I'm committed to efforts to accelerate the development of rare disease drugs, I want to ensure that these drugs are safe. We don't want to hurry drugs to market only to find that they've harmed those patients they were intended to help. So balance is important. The legislation includes provisions to combat the growing shortage of prescription medications, especially drugs for treating cancer. I've heard from a number of healthcare providers and constituents from my district who have reported unprecedented shortages of prescription drugs. Really heartbreaking stories, and I'm pleased that we are taking steps to address their concerns. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that we continue to work in a bipartisan fashion as the FDA Reform Act of 2012 moves forward and beyond that legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you and especially Ryan and Clay on the staff for the hard work, the communication, and the ability to move this piece of legislation. I think it's a good bipartisan effort. Everybody has already brought up the fact that though the media loves to play the game, that this town is just full of people bickering and fighting. Here was a critical bipartisan effort. And let me note that, you know, we're not just talking about medicine. We're talking about jobs here, too. This is and if you really got to look at those of us in that small little state called California and see what the biosciences mean in California, just to give you some idea that according to the California Healthcare Institute, we've got 2,323 and counting companies in California. Estimated, we're looking at $115.4 billion worth of revenue. These companies right now employ 267,000 employees in California with its critical unemployment. So this really is talking about a jobs bill while we're taking care of this medical issue. And let me remind you that these biosciences are California and U.S. jobs that could be lost not in decades like heavy industry, but could be lost in weeks if we don't continue to have the kind of reforms that we're talking about here. And so I'm very excited to work with my colleagues on this, because this is not just a program and a legislation that supports jobs, but it's legislation that will save lives. And how often do we get to do a bipartisan bill that saves the jobs, saves lives, and able to really get the job done in an environment where we're cooperative? Speaking of cooperation, I want to thank my dear friends, Mrs. Capps and DeGette, working with my office at getting the amendments in that was included on this aspect. And let me just say that I hope that this bill is a harbinger of future cooperations on doing things with the FDA, doing things with medical breakthrough and research. Because again, if we can't cooperate on this kind of bill, I don't think we'll find anywhere. And remind you, we may all have constituents that gain jobs or lose jobs in legislation. But Mr. Chairman, when it comes down to life-saving treatments, every one of us knows that we don't know when, but we know sometime our family and our loved ones are going to need the medical breakthroughs that we're helping to perpetuate with this bill. And I want to thank everybody for making sure that future is available. And thank you for the cooperation.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And it will be a great day tomorrow. And listening to my colleagues, I'm just hoping that the media may take note that peace broke out and much was accomplished in energy and commerce. And I really do, in a very serious mode, hope that it is identified when we can work collectively and move forward. I do want to express great appreciation for everyone's hard work. The process has been defined by carefully negotiated compromise and serves as a great example of what this body can do when we set aside political rhetoric in order to actually get our job done. Under the pragmatic and effective leadership of our chairman and ranking members, the hardworking staff has put together a bill that will no doubt improve the effectiveness of the FDA, foster innovation in our healthcare sector, and most importantly, improve patient safety. I want to especially thank Mr. Waxman and his staff for taking time out of their busy schedules to learn about a hurdle being faced by some small inventors in the drug field. This issue is a very specific limitation on patent extensions that disincentivizes small drug innovators, the little guy, the doctor, to come up with breakthrough treatments. I believe that a resolution to this issue can be found that removes this hurdle, yet still prevents manufacturers from gaming the system. We can undoubtedly tweak the current law to achieve these aims. I look forward to continuing working with Mr. Waxman and the committee staff in an effort to find a solution to this specific problem. Again, I'm very proud of the work that has gone into the development of this act, and I will be very proud to cast a vote in favor of it tomorrow as we meet. And I would yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Bass, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to congratulate you and the ranking member and my fellow committee members for putting together what I consider to be a successful bipartisan package that I'm confident will make it to the President's desk in a short period of time. The user fee process is a vital element in both maintaining operations at the FDA to bring valuable drugs and devices through approval pathway and to market. I'm optimistic that with the enhanced financial incentives and resources available to the FDA included in the user fee agreements, we will see a shorter approval time and more valuable and safe products available for patients. Additionally, there are significant drug and device regulatory improvements that will, I believe, increase transparency, market involvement, and encourage the increased development of innovative and life-saving drugs and devices. Specifically, I'm proud of the committee's commitment to bring the need of the rare disease community to the forefront of this debate, both through the medical device legislation as well as a focus on drug development for rare diseases. While all diseases are cruel, rare diseases oftentimes leave both the patient and their loved ones with only questions, no answers, and often no hope. I've learned this personally through the experiences of one of my college roommates and his wife. I was the best man at their wedding, Karen Everett and Karen Cook. Karen overcame, or is trying to overcome, a rare neurological disease known as progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP, which there are no drugs currently on the market to specifically treat the disease. PSP is a progressively debilitating disease which shares symptoms with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, and other neurological diseases affecting the brain and brain function. The symptoms are countless, and the current goal of treatment is to try and control the disease through using a combination of medication approved for other afflictions. It is a constant experiment of seeing what Karen reacts to and what has no effect. There are no drugs on the market developed specifically to combat either this horrific disease or a simple path for companies to get approval for safe treatment of diseases with such small populations. This bill, however, provides hope for the patients and families with rare diseases, with a focus on accelerating the approval pathways for drugs designed to treat rare diseases such as PSP, and providing incentives to manufacturers to invest in the development of these drugs. It can be an attainable goal for an individual and family affected by this disease to not only improve the quality of life, but possibly even find a cure for this and other rare diseases. Now, however, not only do we make improvement on the drug side, but I'm proud to have my bill, H.R. 3211, the Humanitarian Device Reform Act, included in the device regulatory section that would make it easier for device manufacturers to create humanitarian use devices, HUDs, which are the devices created to treat diseases affecting individuals, both children and adults, who suffer from diseases that affect communities 4,000 or fewer each year. Currently, companies who manufacture HUDs are unable to recoup beyond the R&D costs, subsequently restricting entry into the field. This provision would lift the outdated profit cap restriction on devices developed to treat these rare diseases and conditions, and would also do so in a way that maintains incentives for devices developed for both children and adults. It would maintain FDA's current oversight of HUDs, but allow for further development improvements and incentives to make it possible for new device developers to enter the marketplace. I was glad to work with my colleagues as well as the staff on this great piece of bipartisan legislation, and I urge its adoption. I yield back.
Chair would recognize the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Mrs. Christensen, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank you, Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman, Chairman Dingell, and all of the chairs of the subcommittees and members, and of course the staff as well, who worked on H.R. 5651. While not an easy task to achieve, the bipartisan legislation before us includes measures to modernize the FDA review process of new and generic prescription drugs, biosimilars, and medical devices in a manner that not only is more transparent, safer, and faster, but also in a manner that is more fair and just to both the prescription drug and medical device industries, and particularly to the consumers. Additionally, it bolsters and thus promotes greater equity and safety in the development and use of prescription drugs for children, something that is so critically important. And it takes significant steps forward to address our nation's ever-growing challenge with drug shortages. I'm pleased that this legislation also includes incentives for the development of new antibiotics, both those that treat dangerous, life-threatening infections and those that treat infections that may not be perceived as grave, but that can and sometimes do snowball and lead to life-threatening situations. This is true in infections like those caused by Gardnerella and Bacteroides, which have a disproportionate and negative impact on some women of color, leaving them at far greater risk for HIV infection and preterm labor, both of which, of course, can be life-threatening conditions. And so I'm extremely pleased that we have successfully worked together to achieve a strong piece of legislation that does what we have long hoped to accomplish: reform and strengthen many of the Food and Drug Administration's key programs, which together will ensure that Americans have greater and more timely access to safe, affordable therapies and medical devices to treat and manage their conditions and improve their overall health and quality of life. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5651, the Food and Drug Administration Reform Act of 2012, is an important piece of legislation. I want to commend this committee for its bipartisan efforts here today. I'd like to focus my opening on the inclusion of the Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now, or the GAIN Act. According to the World Health Organization, drug resistance is bringing the planet closer to a post-antibiotic era, one in which the bubonic plague is again a real threat to human health. If we are to survive, we need to encourage new antibiotic drug development. The GAIN Act is a critical first step in that process. I've heard reports in the press and statements from members of Congress that the GAIN Act should focus only on serious or life-threatening infections. Let me put forward just a few reasons why that argument, as good as it may sound, is flawed. First, common infections can often grow into serious and life-threatening infections if left untreated. Strep throat or a common ear infection can kill if the original infection is resistant to antibiotics. For instance, I'm aware of a patient with what was at first a simple sinus infection that, because of drug resistance, ended up in the emergency room with a brain abscess. Second, the history of antibiotic drug development is rife with examples of drugs originally developed for use against what are considered non-serious or non-life-threatening infections and only later found to be lifesavers. The quinolone drug class was first developed in 1962 to treat urinary tract infections and was only later found to be a wonder drug in the treatment of tuberculosis. If the supporters of only for serious or life-threatening infections have their way, we may end up ensuring drugs like the quinolones never get to market and a whole slew of life-saving drugs never get to patients in need. That cannot be allowed to happen. Therefore, I would like to encourage this committee to protect the incentives in the GAIN Act and oppose efforts to further weaken them. In addition, I want to thank my co-authors, Gene Green, John Shimkus, Diana DeGette, Mike Rogers, Anna Issue, and Ed Whitfield, as well as their staffs. They were intricate in crafting and advancing this bill. If we are successful in our efforts with GAIN, Congress will have taken a meaningful step toward protecting patients for decades, and I thank them and all of the GAIN Act supporters for their efforts. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair would now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the legislation before our committee today and appreciate the hard work and the bipartisan effort to ensure that our committee acts swiftly to reauthorize the FDA user fee programs. The prescription drug and medical device user fee programs have been important tools in ensuring that patients have access to safe and critical medical services. Most importantly, these programs are about improving and preserving the health and quality of life of all Americans. And these programs also ensure that the United States continues to lead the world in medical research as well as drug and medical device development. From a quality care perspective, these programs have been invaluable in providing access to cutting-edge technologies and new therapies, saving millions of lives. And the legislation before us provides the FDA with tools to make safe and new medicines and devices available to patients in a more efficient and effective manner. From an economic perspective, millions of jobs have been created in America because we continue to lead the world in biomedical research and development, and the reauthorization of these programs will continue our focus on keeping America at the forefront of that research and development. Again, I appreciate the chairman bringing this package to the full committee, and I'm pleased to offer my support for the legislation, and I'll submit the remainder of my opening statement later on, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Okay, gentleman yields back. At this time, I'd like to offer an opening statement.
Yes.
Okay.
For 3 minutes.
I'd like to recognize myself for 3 minutes. First, I'd like to thank the chairman. I'd like to add my thoughts and words in thanking the chairman for his leadership on this important legislation, and I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Today's markup addresses the FDA user fee program. As part of the legislation, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children, BPCA, and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA, will be permanently reauthorized. BPCA and PREA foster the development of safe therapies for children. I fully support this effort. As a mother of 2 children, I know that kids are not just small adults. Research is needed to ensure that treatments for all children are safe and that they work. With that in mind, I'd like to take a moment to bring to your attention legislation that I've been working on with Representatives Capps and DeGette, which will improve pediatric research activities at NIH, including advancing clinical trials on rare and genetic diseases that have their onset in childhood. Some of these diseases include spinal muscle atrophy, muscular dystrophy, Fragile X, and Down syndrome. We plan to introduce this legislation very soon. This legislation is important because it focuses on that subgroup of children who have diseases which can be devastating, do not have treatments, and are often overlooked by the research community. In addition, I've learned that in this age of genomic medicine, we can learn much about common diseases by studying the rare and genetic diseases that have their onset in childhood. I hope the chairman and other members of the committee will work with me on this project in the coming months. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there further opening statements? Okay. The chair calls up H.R. 5651 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 5651, to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to revise and extend the user fee programs for prescription drugs and for medical devices, to establish user fee programs
Without
for generic
objection,
drugs.
the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. For the information of members, we are now on H.R. 5651. The committee will reconvene at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I remind members that the chair will give priority recognition to amendments offered on a bipartisan basis. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Without objection, the committee stands in recess.